One of the most common techniques used by a social engineer is impersonation. They want to pretend to be someone they're not in order to get their target to do something that they shouldn't, or hand over information that they shouldn't. Now, there are various different roles that are particularly attractive to a social engineer when it comes to impersonation. So, for example, they want to impersonate someone with authority. In the first module of the course, I showed a malicious email, allegedly, from the Australian Federal Police claiming that someone had been caught speeding. That's a position of authority. People are going to naturally be more respectful of any communication they get which they believe comes from the police. Another example is someone with seniority. I'm going to give you a very good example of that in just a moment. But here we're usually talking about someone's boss, or the boss's boss. The higher up the food chain, the better, all the way up to the CEO if possible. People respond very differently to people with seniority than what they do to their peers. Another example is someone who's trusted. We just spoke about sysadmins. People will trust someone who they believe to be a sysadmin with things like their credentials. If they can be convinced that the person they're talking to is indeed a legitimate sysadmin, they'll give them information that they wouldn't normally give someone else. So these are just several different possible roles that are really desirable to the social engineer when it comes to impersonation. Let me now give you a perfect example of impersonating someone with seniority. This is an article by Brian Krebs from 2015. And here we're talking about someone being asked by their boss, or at least someone who they thought was their boss, to transfer large sums of money to China. Now there's a couple of curious things about this. Number one is that the request wasn't that unusual. So for the individual involved here, in this case the person that Brian has given the pseudonym Judy to, believes that she's processing a normal request because it's not that unusual. Judy's just trying to do the right thing. But this piece here is particularly interesting. The message was far more formal sounding than the tone of voice her boss normally used. So this goes to show just how careful the social engineer needs to be. And on the one hand, it shows that they probably didn't do their research quite well enough to get the tone right. Yet on the other hand, it shows that Judy was a little bit too trusting of someone who simply claimed to be her boss. Now, fortunately, in this case, the transfer was cancelled before any damage was done. But as Brian goes on to explain in this article, it can actually be a very profitable scam. So this is impersonation of someone with seniority. And it's a very basic example. Let me give you one more example. And I want to show you an actual exchange between the social engineer impersonating someone who was a senior figure and their target. In this case, a target who was a sysadmin. In 2011, the hacktivist collective known as Anonymous hacked HB Gary, which was actually a security company. And there was a lot more background as to why Anonymous targeted them, but what I'm interested in showing here is just one part of how that hack took place. By chaining together a series of attacks, the hackers had managed to compromise the email of the owner of HB Gary, a guy named Greg Hogland. Now that in itself, and the systems that they'd gained access to up until that point, was a very serious attack. But Anonymous wanted to go further. They wanted to break into one particular website which they didn't have the credentials for. In fact, what they wanted to do was SSH into the particular target server. So with control of Greg's email account, they sent an email to someone who was in a sysadmin capacity, someone with the ability to control access to the target server they were looking for. Here's the email the social engineers sent. Now what the attacker is actually doing here is impersonating Greg, who was an individual in a position of seniority, and they're sending it to the sysadmin and asking for the firewall to be opened up to allow SSH to the server. Now there's a little bit of misdirection in this email as well, in that the attacker is not simply coming out and saying, please also give me the password. They had passwords compromised from other HB Gary systems they thought might have been reused, so they came out and asked a question about that. So this practice was less likely to arouse suspicion than simply saying, "Hey, please send me the password." Shortly after, a response came back from the sysadmin. Now the main thing here is he obviously thinks he is speaking to the owner of the company. This would be a perfectly valid response if you were indeed speaking to this person in a position of seniority. Clearly, he's trying to help the person he's speaking to achieve their objective. So here's that other human weakness we come back to, helpfulness. In this case, the sysadmin is so eager to help, he's actually offering to drop the firewall, something that wouldn't normally be done. But you can see how, in thinking he was talking to the owner of the company, the sysadmin was trying to do everything he could to help. That's a very natural reaction. However, that was just what the social engineer needed, because he was able to come back with this. Now, if we jump straight to the bottom, it's clear that this would be very worrying. Hey, just reset my password to change me 123, allow this public IP address in, and then, hey, don't worry, I'll SSH in and reset my password, but just give me this really insecure thing first. But it's the preceding sentence which sets up the scene. I'm ready for a small meeting and I'm in a rush. This is urgency. We spoke about that in the first module as well. By creating a sense of urgency, he's putting the victim in a position where they might act in a way that they wouldn't had they not been under pressure. And ultimately, the sysadmin did grant exactly what the social engineer was asking for, and the attackers gained access to the server. That's how easy it was. All they had to do was ask. Now granted, they did have to gain access to the email account first, so there were things that happened upstream of this particular attack. But the point is that even when what's being asked for is entirely unreasonable, some basic social engineering tricks can cause the victim to act in a way that they wouldn't normally do. Now, there are many different tricks used by an adept social engineer to convince their target that they are actually who they say they are. Let me give you one more example from Kevin Mitnick. Kevin was particularly notorious for social engineering telephone companies. And what he'd frequently do is call up the company and claim to be one of their employees. A trick he used is he'd record the telephone company's advertisements, and then when speaking to someone in there and attempting to convince them that he was a legitimate employee of the company, he'd say, "Hang on a moment, I've got another call coming, I need to put you on hold." And then what he'd do is he'd simply play the company's own advertisement back down the line. Now that's a very simple trick, but it has the effect of the person on the other end of the phone believing that the caller is more legitimate than what they would otherwise seem. And in fact, as he says here, it's very subliminal, it's quite subtle, but it all adds to the charade. And as he goes on to say, once you're part of the in-group, then you get cooperation, you get compliance. And little tricks like this all add together to make a big difference when it comes to impersonation. Let's now move on to the last part of this module, and I want to give you some great examples of social engineering and impersonation that I've personally been involved in the past.